So hey there friends, and welcome to this episode of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. Today we are going to talk about the discomfort associated with knowing that we're being judged and how we can navigate that kind of urge we have to shrink ourselves or change ourselves in order to avoid that or make other people more comfortable. So it's not a small topic that we're diving into this week, but before we get to that, I just want to make a few announcements because it's been a little while since we've done that. Last week, if you tune in every week, you might have noticed that no podcast episodes came out last week. I normally do 2 a week and there were 0 last week. The reason for that, in all honesty, is that I just felt like I was holding way more balls than I could continue to carry in 1 week. And I decided to, put the podcast ball down on the floor. And this was a really conscious choice. If you watch my stories on Instagram, you might have seen that, I still went roller skating, I still played basketball, I still did these other things. And while the podcast is incredibly important to me, there is nothing in my life really that I'm willing to compromise my mental health for. And when I have that feeling that I am juggling more balls than I actually have hands for or capacity for, it used to be that the things that I would let go of were the things that topped me up. Now I'm very conscious of setting aside the things that are important but perhaps not urgent and making sure that I continue to tend to my needs. Now, saying that, I'm still actually incredibly tired this week. I never get, I'm not getting this stuff perfect. And it's important to me that I'm really transparent about that and honest about that. I still feel a little bit overwhelmed this week. I still feel a little bit like, how do I hold all the balls up and, do all of this stuff that I'm committed to? But here we are with an episode. That said, however, there is only going to be 1 episode a week for the foreseeable future. So I can't remember how many Tuesday Tidbit episodes I've done, but I kind of started a second episode on a bit of a whim. When I started the podcast back in 2020, I was doing 2 episodes a week, I think, back then. And I did 2 episodes a week for maybe a year and a half. And then I dropped it back to 1 episode. And then just recently, in the last couple of months, I popped it back up to 2. And we're going to go back down to 1. So for the foreseeable future, it's going to be 1 episode a week because that means that I can put more of my intentionality into that episode, which is super important to me. And then my plan is for 2024 that there'll also be a monthly guest episode. So like a 5th one every month. So stay tuned for all of that. But there's a little update. The other little update is to let you know that the second round of Soma Home will be running in February 2024. So last week we had our final call for the first round of Soma Home. That's my 6-week course for supporting you to feel more at home within their own skin. It is this hybrid of movement and tools from counseling and really helpful, supportive content to kind of get you moving towards this capacity to be able to tend to your needs, respond to your needs, plan for your needs, rather than feeling like you're constantly the last thing on the to-do list. So if that sounds of interest to you, you can join the waitlist for that, which I'll pop the link for that in the show notes of this episode. All right, so on to this week's episode. I do have notes on my desk, so if you are watching this rather than just listening, you'll see me look down a little bit because it's actually a really big topic and I wanted to be sure that I covered all my thoughts. I probably haven't covered all my thoughts because, there's always more, but I wanted to be sure that I was being quite robust in this discussion. And so I will look down a little bit if you are watching on the screen. So this topic, I'm dropping things beside me. This topic is a huge one. And we're talking about this feeling of being judged by other people. It's really interesting when we feel like we're being judged by other people. One of the comments that I hear often and that's been told to me lots of times is like, don't worry about it. They're not even judging you half as much as you think. Most people are so concerned about themselves that they're not really judging you at all. And I actually really disagree with that. I think that we feel threatened by the thought of other people's judgments because we know that it's happening. We know that we're being judged. We feel it. We understand it. And the reason that we know it is because we're privy to both our own judgments and the judgments that other people share with us about other people. And that happens, right? We know it happens. And from a purely brain-based point of view, we know that human brains work like that, right? We know that categorizing things, judging things, making hierarchies of things helps us to make sense of our world because we know which way we want to go. If we know, I like, brown better than black. I like, this way better than that way. It helps us to navigate life with a little bit more clarity and perhaps even a little bit more certainty. And so we know we're being judged. There are people who are less judgmental or who are, I would even say, more just aware of their automatic judgments and so don't put so much weight on them. But we know that we are being judged, and it is deeply, deeply uncomfortable. What I want to talk about today is this reality that goes along with the fear and discomfort of being judged. And that's the fact that for many of us, in the face of that fear of judgment, we will shrink ourselves to make other people less likely to judge us and or more comfortable in our presence, right? We will shrink ourselves, we will change our behavior, we will sit on our opinions, we will dress a certain way, compose ourselves a certain way in order to avoid judgment. The risk of that, though, is that we end up living a life that doesn't feel completely ours, right? We don't feel like we're perhaps being our whole selves, either in general or in certain relationships, because we're fearful of showing that part of us that might, expose us to their judgment. And that judgment might be judgment that we actually get told, right? We might be told, oh, you're a bit much, right? Or I don't like the way that you do X, or I don't know that that looks very good on you, or I don't like what you do. Or that judgment might be something that we sense and feel or worry about, but actually don't know if it's true, right? We often don't have hard evidence of the ways that we're being judged, but we still worry about it, right? And so the risk is that we change ourselves, we shrink ourselves, we please other people in order to avoid the discomfort of that judgment. And that's, I think, where this can get very, very uncomfortable, because it's one thing to sit with the discomfort of oh, I think I'm being judged and I don't like that, of course. And it's another thing to be oh, because I'm being judged, perhaps there's something wrong with me. And perhaps the best thing that I could do would be to change me so that I can avoid their judgment, rather than to question their judgment or dismiss their judgment or just get on with our lives, right? So that's the risk. And yet sitting with the discomfort, or not even sitting with the discomfort, trying to avoid the discomfort by changing ourselves is often the thing that we will do, because it's available and accessible, and it doesn't require us necessarily to sit with the discomfort in the same way. But I'm going to hopefully share a few tips with you today that will open up some space for a different response. Now, like I said in the intro, or a little while ago, I don't want to sort of pretend that I'm standing on some kind of pedestal here and I am immune to any of this. Absolutely not. I was openly judged in recent days after I posted the question I posted on Instagram, actually. And, I felt crap. It felt awful. And I want to be very clear in saying that these are just some ideas, some questions. I think I have more questions than I have answers for you, which I think is a really important place to start. I have made huge strides in this area in my own life compared to where I used to kind of hang out and play. But I'm absolutely not immune to this either. So let's explore together. So let's start with clues, right? What are the clues that we might be shrinking ourselves, changing ourselves, modifying our behavior, modifying our looks, modifying something in order to avoid judgment or avoid the discomfort of that. I think the biggest one is feelings of resentment. Resentment is such a red flag moment for me. As soon as I start to feel resentful, it's like, where am I perhaps shrinking myself or dismissing my needs or dismissing myself in my life right now? Because generally when there is resentment, it kind of points in that direction, right? Where we've been giving away pieces of ourselves, giving away time, giving away energy, and feeling like the return is not fair. So resentment is a really big one. Feeling disconnected, right? If we are discarding pieces of ourselves or shrinking pieces of ourselves, then we might well feel disconnected because we feel like we're not all of ourselves. We're not our true kind of version of ourselves. And so disconnection is one. Anger, I would say, is another one. I want to put a little asterisk next to anger though, because sometimes we're we hear anger and we think that that's bad. Anger is not a bad emotion. And often your anger will be justified, right? 100%. And so I'm not saying, if you feel angry, we need to look at how do we eliminate that. It's not that kind of conversation, but more if we're feeling that kind of undercurrent of anger, which could sit side by side with resentment. Is there a clue in that perhaps we're giving pieces of ourselves away that we would rather not? Blame and shame would be another one. And some of these overlap with each other, right? So often when we feel judged, we then internalize that sense of judgment and we start to question, am I wrong? Is it me, right? Should I be different? Is it possible to be different? How do I change myself to make them happy? How do I change myself to avoid their judgment? How do I change myself in order to, fit the mold? And so that internal shaming and that external blaming and even internal blaming actually is another clue, perhaps, that we're doing this in our lives. And with that comes the self-judgment, right? Starting to question, maybe I am bad for being like this. Maybe I should be different. Maybe I could be different. That self-judgment is another clue that perhaps we are changing ourselves in the face of this fear of judgment. And it's interesting because I think that this sort of shrinking and changing of ourselves that we do can feel a lot like kindness towards other people, right? If you have any sense of being a people pleaser, right, of kind of moving through a life with this external gaze on how can I keep the people around me happy, you know this, right? You know this feeling of kind of feeling like we're doing other people a service by helping them to manage their emotion by altering the way that we behave or the way that we interact with them. And that can feel like a kindness because in the moment, in the immediacy of that relationship, we get fed back that the way that we've, managed ourselves and supported that person by changing ourselves worked. They're happier. They're happy with us. They're not mad. But it really is a false sense of kindness, I think, because it's a kindness that dismisses you, right? It dismisses your needs. It dismisses your truth. And at the end of the day, it kind of just excuses the potential manipulation that's coming from that other person. Now, that's not to say that all people pleasing has a manipulative element to it. Of course not. Sometimes it's all the person sort of doing the pleasing. We've learned from one of our relationships that that's how we have to kind of move through the world and we apply it everywhere. And sometimes that is not kind of met with anything on the other person's part, right? But there is this lack of kindness, I think, that goes both ways because we're dismissing ourselves and in the process also kind of almost suggesting that that person doesn't have the capacity to hold their own emotional experience, right? If we're constantly trying to control the experience of somebody else, then we're sort of saying, well, you don't have the capacity to control your own. And so we're not allowing them to have that personal responsibility or that personal that personal responsibility to be able to hold their own emotion and their own responses to things. So I want to back up a little bit actually before we go any further and just talk about the very real reason why judgment hurts so much. Oftentimes I think we need to be less sensitive. Like, oh, maybe I'm just overthinking. Maybe I'm just really hypersensitive to this stuff. And like, maybe there is an element of, feeling sensitive to that. But from an evolutionary kind of point of view, it's really important to us humans that we are accepted by our fellow humans, because we rely on each other for so much of our survival, right? The human to human connection, community, relationship. We rely on each other to keep us resourced in terms of food and shelter and connection and the ability to breed and the ability to be together. And so it's important that we are accepted by the people around us. And if we're rejected, then it's a very kind of primal fear of being ostracized, right? Of being rejected from the people who matter to you. And so I think we have to have some compassion for the human condition when we talk about this topic, because it's not just a you problem of like, oh, you're just so sensitive. Maybe you are sensitive, and that's, I'm a very sensitive person. Which sometimes feels like a curse and sometimes feels like a huge gift. So, depending on the day. So let's, suggest that there is some role for sensitivity to play in that. But at the same time, let's have some compassion for the human condition that says, oh, being liked actually is important to our sense of community connection and survival. So I think that's an important kind of base to set up here. Because if we don't have that understanding and we don't acknowledge that truth, then it can become this self-responsibility piece of kind of being like, well, I just have to toughen up. I just have to try harder, right? Whereas I think we can sit back with a little bit of compassion and go, oh, this is what it is to be human. Interesting. Yeah. So if we rewind a little bit to this idea of like, this shrinking and changing ourselves can feel a little bit like kindness, but it isn't really at the heart of it. Part of the reason that it can feel like kindness is because it immediately kind of removes the discomfort of the potential rub that we experience if we don't shrink ourselves and we don't change who we're being. And so that immediate removal of discomfort can feel great, right? It can feel really lovely. When we've put on something, just to use an example of kind of our physical appearance, when we've put on something that makes us feel joyful and expressive and delighted, and then we look in the mirror and we're like, what will people think? Oh, I'll just change, right? I'll just put on that black dress that feels a little bit safer. It immediately removes the discomfort of what will they think. Immediately. So it can feel great in that sense. And yet there's this little piece of you that's like, oh, but what if I could be that person, right? Who just went out in that coat and felt amazing, or put that dress on and didn't give two hoots what anyone else thinks. So we have discomfort either way. And that's just one example, right? You can probably think of a million. But we have discomfort either way. But I think part of the reason why the people pleasing or the shrinking can feel so much easier is because it is an immediate removal of some level of discomfort in some way. So if we know, though, that there is some discomfort either way, we can start to get curious about, well, which discomfort do I want to choose? It is a false narrative to believe that we can just simply avoid discomfort if we just try hard enough and get it right. There is no avoiding discomfort in this human life. There just isn't. Often doing the things that feel most aligned for us are also uncomfortable because of this very nature of having to negotiate and navigate what it is to be in relationship with other humans who are doing the judging and who are doing these things that perhaps sometimes make us feel uncomfortable. But avoiding discomfort is going to be a fruitless pursuit because it's just completely impossible. And so understanding that, oh, okay, there will be discomfort. That is not a sign that I'm defective. It is a confirmation that I am indeed human, right? And so I think that that's an important thing to acknowledge. So I want to give you a tip here in terms of something that I've found really useful and something that I share with clients often. And it's a tool from acceptance and commitment therapy. And the official kind of way that we talk about this is to call it diffusion. And so it's an ability to diffuse from our thoughts, or kind of get a little bit of space from our thoughts. And it's this piece of acknowledging, right? Acknowledging, oh, I'm feeling really uncomfortable at the thought that they might be judging me for what I'm wearing, what I said, blah, 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 blah. And so it's kind of taking it and putting it a little bit outside of yourself and saying, oh, I'm noticing this. I'm noticing that this is what's going on for me. This feeling that I'm experiencing, this fear that I'm holding, I'm noticing that I'm really uncomfortable at the thought that this person might be judging me, or this community might be judging me, or these people might be judging me. And that makes me feel like I want to shrink, change, blah, 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 right? So it's acknowledging and it's diffusing kind of at the same time, because we're giving it a voice. We're giving it words. I'm having a thought that. I'm having the feeling that. The other part of that is to just have a little moment of recognition that you actually are not responsible for looking after other people's reactions to things and emotions about things. So when we've had this dynamic of feeling like we need to adjust ourselves to please another person, to keep them happy, to stop them from being mad, kind of that feeling of like walking on eggshells and hoping that we can just behave in the right way to kind of get the right outcome with that person. It can feel very much like we know how to navigate that, right? I know I've always described myself as being very good at keeping the peace. And it's like, for a long time, I thought of that as being a really good thing. And now as I have gotten a bit older, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. What parts of myself did I give away in the pursuit of that goal, right? Not to say that peace isn't a wonderful thing, of course it is, but it can be a false sense of that too. But recognizing that, you know what, I'm not responsible for how that person receives and holds their own discomfort. I am responsible for being, a kind human, absolutely. I'm not going to go out there and just like spray abuse at people. But at the same time, if I am being kind and I am being clear and I'm being true to my boundaries and I'm being true to myself and I'm, just kind of like operating as a human that has empathy for and kindness towards others, then the judgments of others, the discomfort of others is not actually my responsibility. And that is a hard thing to hold sometimes, because you're like, but I could make them so happy if I just said this or I just did this. Yes, but what is the thing that you lose in that process? That's always the question. When I can't remember if I said this before, but I kind of posted in my Instagram stories about this idea, maybe yesterday, the day before, as I'm recording this. And I posted something about this idea, right? Of the fact that, yeah, you are being judged. You know you are, and that's, it's deeply uncomfortable. And yet it is not your responsibility to shrink yourself and change yourself in order to make these people more comfortable. And I asked the question of like, what is the prickly part of this for you? What's the hardest part to navigate? Because I kind of prefaced that I was going to do an episode about it and could maybe answer some questions. And I got a few, which I'm going to read out and try to do my best to answer. But one of the things that also happened was I had a lot of just responses in my inbox to that first story where I said, this is not your responsibility to shrink and change yourself in order to make these people comfortable. And I want to share some of the ways that people responded so that you can really hear that you are not alone if you feel like this. Because I had a lot of responses, and I don't get a lot of, DMs on Instagram. I haven't got a huge audience there, but I had a lot of responses of people being like, yes, this is my life. Things like, wow, you nailed it. This is 100% how I feel. And so you're not alone. And isn't it interesting that we're all potentially walking around, or there's like a big cohort of us walking around, all doing this to each other. And none of us are really explicitly asked for it. And yet, it's been my experience that now kind of in my 40s, I'm starting to unravel this for myself of going, oh, there's a good chance I've lived 4 decades of my life this way. And I don't want to do that anymore. And it's not comfy. Like, I'm not going to lie, it's not a comfortable place sometimes, because I'm rediscovering parts of myself that I'm like, is this me? Is this me removing the conditioning and the desire to please other people? Is this new? Is this a part of myself that I'm just meeting and discovering? So it can kind of be like liberating and a little uncomfortable all at the same time. But you're not alone. And I think that's really important to hear. You are not alone if this is something that you're like, God, this feels so hard, right? I don't even know if I can ever let it go. It's tricky, but here we are together having the conversation. So I want to read out some of the questions that came through. The first one was, I love this question actually. So the first question was how to not care about judgment. I can tell myself not to care, but that doesn't always permeate into my being. This to me is very similar to what I said kind of towards the start of this episode, where, the well-meaning advice of like, just don't care about it. Just don't worry about it. People are usually so much more worried about themselves. Just let it go, I think it's well-meaning advice, and I think it's a really fair question to be like, well, how can I just not care? But I think the reality is that you do and will care for the most part. I mean, I know some people who are like, I literally give like no F's about this at all. I don't care what other people think. You can just you can leave whatever you think at the door because don't care at all. And I believe that that is true for a lot of people or some people. But I think the more common experience is like, I really do care. And this really makes me uncomfortable. And I would really like to not care, but I don't know how. And so my answer to this, or my question, I guess, around this, because like I said, I think I have more questions than answers necessarily. But like, what happens if you acknowledge that you do care? What happens if we start there? You say, you know what, I actually really do care. And it makes me feel really sad or uncomfortable or angry or whatever, that there's a chance that I'm being judged about my decision to, or my, whatever, insert any number of things you might feel judged about, and give it a little bit of space to breathe, right? I feel really uncomfortable about the fact that I might be judged for blah. And notice that there is discomfort associated with that. I'm acknowledging my discomfort. I think that then we get to notice that then we have a little bit of space to choose. So if I really care, I still have a moment where I can choose. I can choose, okay, well, I could do what I know how to do, which is shrink myself, change myself, feel bad about the situation, and just kind of carry on. Or I could acknowledge that I feel uncomfortable about the reality that I might be being judged, but choose to acknowledge that it's actually also more important for me to feel authentically me, to go and live my life the way that I want to be the person that I want to be in the world, to wear what I want to wear in the world, to express myself in the way that I want to express myself in the world. And yeah, I might feel uncomfortable because I know that I'm opening myself up for judgment in a way that doesn't feel good. But what's more important to me? And sometimes the answer will be it's more important for me to feel comfortable. And so we will do the shrinking thing. I think it's important to acknowledge that that is true, right? Because sometimes we set ourselves up and we're like, right, okay, from today, that's it. I'm not going to give 2 hoots about what anyone thinks. And then tomorrow rolls around and we're like, shit, I do care. Oh no, like what do I do now? I failed. And it's like, well, no, you're human, right? And so we have to be able to meet ourselves with compassion in that and notice, oh, like sometimes this is straight up uncomfortable. And when we start to recognize that perhaps there's a window where we get to choose, we don't have to get into the, well, what's the right decision? What's the wrong decision? We can just start to notice, oh, I do have a choice, right? I do have a choice. There might be discomfort in either direction potentially, but which one pulls me to it, right? Or like, where are my values? This is one of those places that we can really pull on our values and be like, well, what am I committed to in terms of the way that I want to show up in my life? And there's an episode about values, which I'll link. There's a couple actually. I'll make sure I link them in the show notes. But kind of knowing what is our why, right? Like what's our guiding beacon here in terms of how we want to show up in the world. And I can only speak from my experience, but often knowing that, right? Like knowing, oh, I want to move towards intentionality, or I want to move towards authenticity, or I want to move towards self-kindness or self-expression or whatever, like insert any value you like. That can help to make it clearer, right? To be like, that's actually what I'm committed to moving towards. So yeah, there's going to be a period of discomfort here as I do that, but I'm also feeling very aligned with that path. And so acknowledging that, yeah, I do care and it's uncomfortable. And then knowing that we have a choice. Little side note, one of the things that I have done, can you hear the dog barking? One of the things that I've done in kind of the last several years is choose a word of the year. And for me, this often straddles like my business and my personal life in terms of how I want to show up. And this, I guess, is similar, adjacent to having our values and knowing what our values are. And it can be really helpful. So I might talk about this more. I haven't picked my word yet. I'm kind of deciding between a few, but maybe we'll talk about that in an early episode in 2024. If you do that, if you have a word or you go through your values at the beginning of a year, let me know, because I'd love to know your process, so I can learn from that as well. But sometimes it is so helpful to have a word or words or values or something that helps us to just get a little bit of altitude when we feel this confliction, right? Because we feel the conflict of like, oh, how do I move away from what feels like a very practiced response, a very practiced, almost automatic experience? And I think that's how we do it, by knowing what it is we're moving towards, knowing what it is that's important to us. Because so many of these things just play out based on repetition, habit, trying to navigate our way safely through the world. And so also don't blame yourself for kind of being in this place of like, oh, how do I move in a different direction? Because it's worked. Right? Here we are. We're here and we've navigated this human life so far. And so these strategies that we come up with to do that and to stay, relatively safe, quote unquote, I'm putting that in quote marks in terms of we're here. I think we have to have some gratitude for our brain and our body's very clever way of adapting to the environment that we find ourselves in. So also taking that perspective, right, and being like, oh, well, it's not all bad. It's actually worked in a lot of ways. But now it's not how I want to necessarily navigate going forward. So recognizing that we have that choice. So the next question that came through, I liked all the questions. I liked them all. They were all really, really interesting questions. And this one was, the people pleasing runs so deep. Can it ever truly be undone? Such an interesting question. And what I want to offer up in response to this is a question to your question, which is, what if we shift the goalposts from this all or nothing kind of way of seeing it, I guess, like it's either here or it's undone, to kind of shifting that to like an awareness, an exponentially increasing awareness of our capacity for choice. Because again, to kind of have this view of like it has to either be the way that I operate or it has to be undone. And I'm not suggesting that that's what the person asking the question is really saying, but I think it's a helpful way for me to look at it to answer this question. Again, it kind of makes it out that how we've been doing things is wrong. And I want to challenge that idea, I think, because when we kind of go into it thinking, well, what I've been doing is wrong, we get stuck in that shamey, blamey, icky kind of cycle. So what if we looked at it and went, that's worked, right? That's been a strategy that I've made my way to this point in my life with. And now I'm not sure I want to do that anymore. And so I'm going to be conscious of how I make my choices to relate moving forward. And so it is, to me, it is this increased level of awareness, this increased awareness of choice, and also recognizing that it's easier to do this in some relationships than others. So there might be certain relationships where you're like, I don't know how to open up a doorway to choice here. I feel so compelled just to please and just to do this thing. Whereas in another relationship, we might be like, I'm all over it. Don't care what you think, right? And so recognizing that not all relationships are equal in that regard. It might be really easy for you to be like, strangers on the street, don't care. Check out my clothes. Think what you think. I don't care. But then we bump into, an auntie or a parent or a sibling or a friend from high school, and we're like, I really care what you think, right? And so all relationships are not the same. It's not like we either just feel completely, stifled by this, or we're free of this feeling of needing to please or fear of judgment. If only it was that simple, right? And so can we ever be truly free of it? I don't know that we can, because we are, again, compelled by our nature, right? We're compelled by our physiology to want to be liked. And I don't like the way that sounds kind of defeated, and I don't think it needs to be at all. But I think that what happens is we increase our awareness of what is driving us, because so often we don't see this stuff. For years and years and years, we might live our life not really seeing what is driving us to behave in a particular way or to respond in a particular way. And so this framework allows us to say, oh, this is interesting. I see some of the things that are at play here. And if we can meet that with compassion, with curiosity, and with kindness, then it's not about trying to get it right. It's just about, well, what ways do I want to navigate this going forward? I think it's very valuable to remove this idea of like, well, what's the right way? What's the wrong way? How do I just like eliminate these bad habits, or however you want to term them, and move in the right direction? It's like, well, no, what if we can just be more curious about this humanity that is in all of us, and explore? So that would be my thoughts around that. And then the last question that I am going to read out is tips for navigating time with family that makes me feel put back in boxes I thought I was out of. I love that description of feeling like we're in a box that we had previously, packed down and removed. I have quite a few notes about this, because this is a huge one and very timely, given that we are in December and possibly increasing amounts of time spent with family and extended family as well, maybe. This analogy of the box, I think, is really helpful, because we have to remember that a box can open, right? And so as a side note, if you feel put in a box, I want you just to remember, oh, that box has a top, right? Like that box has an opening that I can open and get myself out of at any point. So here's my tips for navigating with family. We come back to this idea that, we of acknowledging, right? I love spending time with all of our families. We've got sort of, multiple families, and I love spending time with all of them. But it would be a lie to say that sometimes it's not with it, that it doesn't have any challenges. Of course it does. So can we acknowledge the risk that we face, right? Of going, oh, I think there's a risk that I'm going to feel judged in this space. And I know that when that happens, this is how I tend to respond. Okay, at least I'm like facing that full on, right? I'm not pretending that it doesn't exist. I'm not pretending that it might not happen. I know about the potential capacity for that to be the truth. And then what we can do is we can resource ourselves first, because things feel so much more overwhelming when we're already under stress. And like we see this everywhere in December, everywhere, right? You're at the shopping center with all the people, and people are short in terms of their, they're snappy, they're short, they're angry, they're cross, because all of the pressures, right? The spending, the expectations, the work pressures, the family pressures, the world pressures, all kind of to come in this perfect storm, and people feel under-resourced in so many different ways, and that can come out in, our behavior. And so knowing that there are additional pressures on you, and I'm not just talking about obviously the festive season, but just in general, can we resource ourselves before we go into those scenarios, right? So I know I'm having a catch up with family. What can I do to resource myself first so that I feel like I have this expanded space in which to hold the discomfort that might be present in that room, right? So that might be making sure that we go for a walk beforehand, getting enough sleep the night before if that's possible. It will be different for everybody, but there are a couple of ideas. Making sure that we've eaten, we're not hungry when we show up. Doing something that brings us joy, so that we simply enhance and expand our capacity to be present in that scenario, and to feel like we have the resources to hold some of our own discomfort. The second part is, again, to kind of recognize the humanity in this, right? So many times, and I think in those long-term relationships that we have with family, where there's a dynamic that feels like it's almost just like etched into the family DNA, we can feel a little bit like we're not in control, right? Like something's said and it's like, I'm triggered immediately. And so recognizing and acknowledging the humanity in that and the survival instinct in that, right? The need to be included and belong and be loved and to be accepted. It's very real. And so if we know that that's kind of the backdrop against which we're all kind of relating to each other, I think that can help. And so then coming back to the acknowledgement of, I'm noticing that Dad's just said this thing and I feel really angry. Or, Auntie Pam has commented on my appearance and that's making me feel shame. If we can acknowledge it, again, we can get a little bit of distance and remind ourselves of like, well, what's important to me in this moment, right? What's important to me in terms of how I choose to respond and show up to that. And really meeting ourselves with so much compassion, regardless of where we go with that. So noticing that if we do decide to like placate, shrink, etc., that we're doing it because we feel the need to do that, to sort of survive that interaction, that relationship. If we choose to not do those things, to not play out that ordinary dynamic that we've kind of repeated over a lifetime, that there's going to be some discomfort in that, and really seeing ourselves in that discomfort and offering ourselves kindness and love in the midst of it. So that same language, right? Like I'm noticing that, I'm having the feeling that, it gives us a little bit of distance and potentially opens up a door to have a different response. And then my final tip on that one is to have some kind of soothing tip, self-soothing tool in your pocket. And that might be your metaphorical pocket, not an actual pocket, but knowing, I've been practicing using my breath to help regulate my nervous system. I'm going to just take some time to, maybe go to the bathroom and take 2 minutes to do my breathing practice, or do it right there at the table, or push my feet into the floor and remind myself of the support from the ground, or find that person in the room who I trust to kind of support me in this and like lock eyes with them, or to release the tension in my belly, shake my arms, shake my legs, right? Have some tool that you're like, yes, I know that I have this right there at my disposal and I can use it in the moment to help me regulate. Because what happens is when we are feeling the threat, right, the threat of that judgment, it is experienced as a proper threat in our nervous system. And so we are going to have some kind of nervous system response to that felt threat. Your heart might start to race. Your breath might get a little bit more intense. You might start finding your muscles tensing up. You might start feeling like you want to run out of that house or get angry or whatever. And so knowing that, this is a very real felt threat to my nervous system, how can I offer myself, those tools that help me to regulate? And the breath is always my favorite. It's not everybody's favorite, but being able to slow your breath down, deepen your breath, and know that there is a level of discomfort, right, that we might need to breathe through, sit through, and hold. I think it is just such a disservice to ourselves to believe that avoiding discomfort is the goal. Again, futile goal. If we make that our goal, we're always going to be disappointed, because sometimes even delight, has physical sensations that you might be like, oh, this is a little different, a little uncomfortable. But discomfort is going to be a necessary part of this human experience. And so knowing that that's true is really, really helpful. And then my final thought for this episode, this one's running a little longer, but my final thought for this is to also then be conscious of your judgments of others. And I say this not in a blamey kind of way, right? Like I want to be sure that I'm hopefully being heard in the way that I intend, which is, can you hold space to get curious about the judgments that you make of other people? This might seem somehow different to what we're talking about, but I think that they're very much related. I think part of the reason that we fear others' judgments so much is because we know that we judge ourselves, right? We know that we judge ourselves, literally internally we judge ourselves, and we are walking around making judgments of other people. Are you able to notice too that the judgments that you make of other people are also this way of trying to make sense of your world and find a sense of safety and certainty and surety in your space? We don't have to believe the judgments that our brain conjures up. We can notice them, acknowledge them, and be like, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting that I don't really like what she's wearing? And yet I hope that she is delighted by that. And that is more important than what I think. I don't care, right? So sometimes I think it's helpful to notice that we will just have judgments because we like certain things more than others, right? We're drawn to certain things more than others. We have probably expectations of other people's behavior as well. We have expectations of how things should be. Can you start to get a little bit of distance of that too for yourself and be like, oh, that's really interesting. I'm judging that. It's helping me feel more certainty, more security, more whatever. And it's just my thoughts, right? I don't even have to believe them, and it certainly doesn't have to impact that person's desire and capacity to go out into the world and be who they want to be. And I think that's where we can start to see that, if my judgments are having, like they don't even have to leave my own head, I can kind of have this conversation with myself in my head. My judgments make no difference to that person, because I'm not going over there and being unkind. I'm not, talking about them behind their back. I'm not doing any of those things. I'm just noticing, oh, that's interesting. I don't really like her shoes, right? Or whatever. We can start to see that, the pain of that judgment is because we fear that something in us is wrong, right? We fear that we are not good enough if somebody else is judging us. And yet I think when we start to analyze or interrogate our own judgments of other people and other things, we can start to see that it doesn't really threaten that person and who they are, because it actually has nothing to do with them. And I think we really can start to see that when we're willing to get a little closer to our own judgments. Now, if we're really tied up in those judgments, we might think it really does have something to do with them, right? Because we feel really justified in our beliefs. And in some scenarios that might feel very warranted. And in other scenarios, we might be like, oh, that's really interesting. That is really just a deeply held value of mine, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily black and white true. So give yourself space to be curious about both. And that's, I think, a little bit of a bonus idea or question for this. All right. 45 minutes, 50 minutes. That was a long one. Thank you for sticking with me if you're still here. I would love to know your thoughts. Like I said, I feel like with all of the topics that we talk about here, there's always so much more to learn, to know, to explore, to get curious about, to understand in relationship with each other. And so I just want to remind you that I am here for a two-way conversation. Even though this podcast is very one way because it's me here with my camera and my computer, if you have thoughts that you are willing to share with me, takeaways, ideas, questions in response to the questions that I've asked, I would so love to hear them. So please don't hesitate to reach out. You can put a comment if you're on YouTube. You can DM me over on Instagram. I'm at Erica Webb _SelfKind. And that's it. I'm going to leave you there. I hope that this gives you some food for thought. I hope the questions get some ideas percolating in your head. And I hope that it gives you some tools to actually move into the world, feeling like you can retain more pieces of yourself and take up more space, knowing that, it's not your responsibility to shrink in order to keep other people more comfortable. All right, until next week, keep being kind to yourselves, and I'll speak to you then.